On a deserted Georgia highway, Deputy Sheriff Rick Grimes drives his police cruiser past overturned and damaged cars scattered on the road, which forces him to stop. He gets out of the car and takes a can of gasoline out of the trunk. He walks past the remains of wrecked and abandoned cars down the hill to the gas station. Various corpses and garbage are scattered around the gas station, where a homemade sign with the inscription "No Gas" hangs. Rick looks around when suddenly he hears something and crouches behind the car. He sees on the other side of the car the bare feet of a little girl who picks up a teddy bear from the ground. He gets up and sees that the girl is leaving, so he comes closer to her. Rick keeps calling her until she turns to face him. Her lips and right cheek are torn, exposing exposed teeth and muscles. Rick's face drops as she starts to approach him, growling. She approaches faster, he steps back, pulls out his Colt Python and shoots her in the head. As her body falls to the floor, Rick lowers the gun. About 2 months earlier, Rick and his partner and best friend Shane Walsh are eating hamburgers and French fries in their police car. They joke about the differences between men and women. When the conversation turns to Rick's wife, Lori, he turns somber. He says they've been fighting lately, and says that morning Lori accused him of not taking care of his family in the presence of their son Carl. Suddenly, the walkie-talkie turns on, reporting an impending high-speed chase involving 2 armed suspects. Rick and Shane are getting ready to stop the criminals. Rick and Shane drop the food and rush to the crime scene. Arriving at the place, they lay a studded strip and meet with their colleagues Lambert Kendall and Leon Bassett. While they're all waiting for the car, Leon reflects on their chances of getting on a reality show about police chases. Rick advises him to focus and worry about having a cartridge in the chamber of the gun and the safety off. At this moment, a car pulls up, pursued by 2 more cars, in which there are employees of the Linden County Sheriff's Department. A car with suspects inside overcomes a lane with spikes at speed, punching tires. The driver loses control of the controls, and the car pulls off the road, turning over several times, after which it roughly stops with its wheels up in the field. Rick cautiously approaches the overturned car. A man gets out of the car and immediately starts shooting at the officers. Rick yells at him to drop the gun, but he shoots right at Rick and hits him in the chest. Shane shoots the shooter, killing him, and Rick falls to the ground. The second man gets out of the car with a shotgun, but is also shot. Rick discovers that there is nothing wrong with him, since he was wearing a bulletproof vest. He asks Shane not to tell Laura about what happened. Meanwhile, the third shooter, unnoticed by everyone, crawls out of the car and makes his way through the grass. He fires a pistol and hits Rick in the side, where he is not protected by a bulletproof vest. He falls to the ground, bleeding, and Shane shoots the third and kills him, after which he rushes to Rick's aid. He begs Rick to stay with him, shouts at Leon to call an ambulance, but Rick remains motionless. Some time later, Shane brings Rick flowers to the hospital, but Rick does not regain consciousness until Shane starts talking to him. After an unknown time, Rick wakes up and reacts to Shane's presence. He discovers that Shane is no more. The flowers withered and died, the beeps of the machine stopped, like the clock, the ward is empty. Weak, dehydrated and lonely, Rick gets out of bed and falls to the floor. He calls the nurse to help him, but no one comes. Rick manages to get up, and he stumbles into the bathroom, drinks water directly from the tap, and then heads for the door. Opening the door, he notices that the entrance to the ward is blocked by a gurney. He pushes her aside and continues walking down the dark and disheveled corridor. Lights flicker in the hallway, wires hang from the ceiling. He goes to the nurse's post and tries to make a phone call, but it doesn't work. He finds a set of matches and looks for something else to take from the table. Suddenly, a flickering light attracts his attention, and through the doorway Rick sees the nurse's devastated body, stripped of most of the skin. Rick steps back in horror. Continuing down the corridor, he sees that the walls are covered with blood with numerous bullet holes. The double door leading to the dining room is chained shut, a message is scrawled on it in black paint not to open, dead inside. A pair of gray disheveled hands penetrates through the cracks and fiddles with the lock and chains, moans and groans when all the new fingers with a growl penetrate through the cracks. Terrified, Rick steps back. He tries to get into the elevator, but it doesn't work, so he exits through a heavy door onto a dark landing that smells of rotting flesh. Choking on the smell, he descends the stairs, lighting matches until he finds a way out. At the back of the hospital, a door opens onto a loading dock. As Rick's eyes adjust to the bright sunlight, he sees hundreds of decomposed, fly-covered bodies wrapped in sheets and stacked in rows and piles. He leaves the hospital and stumbles up the hill. There is a military helicopter, sandbags and other signs of a military cordon, but everything has been abandoned. He wanders along the road in a hospital gown and notices an overturned bicycle in the park. When he reaches out to him, the badly decomposed body of a mutilated woman without legs and lips turns and reaches out to him, moaning and growling piteously. Rick falls off his bike from fright, but after a moment he regains consciousness, gets on his bike and hurriedly drives away. Rick rides his bike to his house and discovers that the front door is open and there is no one in the house. Sobbing on the floor, he calls for Lori and Carl, doubting whether it's all real or if he's dreaming. He leaves the house and sits on the steps. He notices a man stumbling on the road and waves his hand, trying to get his attention. At this moment, a boy sneaks up behind him and hits him with a shovel. The boy's father, Morgan Jones, approaches the stumbling man Rick was waving at and shoots him in the head. Then he approaches the scream and points the revolver in his face, demanding to explain why his side is bandaged, but Rick loses consciousness before he can answer. Later that night, Rick wakes up with his arms and legs tied to the bed. A young guy, Dwayne, stands guard with a baseball bat. Morgan came in and asked if he had been bitten. Rick informs him that he has been wounded and is therefore bandaged. Morgan frees him from the bonds, but warns that he will kill him if he tries to do something. Rick recognizes the house they are in as the home of his neighbors Fred and Cindy Drake. Rick then accuses Morgan of murder for shooting the man Rick was waving at. But Morgan says the man was a walker. He expresses regret about firing a gun, as it will attract even more walkers. He warns Rick not to open the shutters he has hung on the window, as walkers outside will see the light and will be attracted to the house. While they are having dinner, Morgan realizes that Rick doesn't know what happened and informs him about what happened. During Rick's stay in a coma, recently deceased people suddenly began to come to life and devour innocent people, and turn others into walkers like them through bites. Eventually, this led to a worldwide social collapse in which walkers began to dominate. Morgan tells Rick what will happen if you are bitten by a walker, claiming that as a result of the fever you will burn, and then die and turn back into a walker. Morgan claims he saw it happen. But he refuses to answer with whom exactly. Suddenly, the car alarm goes off, and Dwayne turns off the lights in the house, and Rick and Morgan look out through tightly closed windows and boarded doors. The street is filled with walkers attracted by the alarm noise. When a woman in a nightgown appears and approaches the front door of the house, Dwayne runs away in tears. Morgan comforts her son, and Rick looks at the woman through the peephole of the front door. The woman looks around and tries to turn the door handle, but eventually gives up and leaves. Morgan remorsefully tells Rick that the walker was his wife and when she died, he couldn't bring himself to kill her and let her go so she could wander the streets. The next morning, Rick goes outside in a protective mask and with a baseball bat. Finding a walker nearby, Morgan tells Rick that the only way to finally kill a walker is to destroy his brain. Rick walks up to the walker and repeatedly hits his head with a bat until he dies. He gets tired quickly, most likely due to a non-healing gunshot wound. Back at Rick's house, he tells Morgan that he thinks his wife and son are still alive. He explains that he found empty drawers in the bedrooms, and family photos and photo albums disappeared. Morgan laughs at this, mentioning that his wife did the same thing when they evacuated. Dwayne suggests to Rick that they might be in Atlanta. Morgan explains that the government told people to go to the refugee center with military protection and food until the broadcast stopped. He also explains that the Center for Disease Control is rumored to be working on a cure. Rick, Morgan and Dwayne go to the King County Sheriff's Department, where they enjoy a hot shower thanks to a separate propane heating system. While they are getting dressed, Morgan tells Rick that his family was heading to Atlanta, but he and Dwayne never got there because they got stuck after his wife was bitten, and after her death they stayed at the Drake house. After that, Rick collects a duffel bag with weapons and changes into a sheriff's uniform and hat. He hands Morgan the rifle and ammunition. They go outside and start loading weapons into the trunk of his car. Rick is getting ready to go to Atlanta, and Morgan says that he will follow him in a few days when Dwayne learns how to shoot. Rick hands Morgan a walkie-talkie and tells him to turn it on every day at dawn to establish communication. Before leaving, Morgan warns Rick that sometimes walkers can gather in a herd, which can be dangerous if you meet them unprepared. Then Rick notices a revived Leon, who has clawed at the chain-link fence separating them. Rick admits that he does not think too highly of the young officer, but he will not leave him in this state. He shoots a revolver into the forehead of the revived Leon, laying him on the ground. Then she and Morgan drive away from the sheriff's department in different directions. Back at the Drake house, Morgan boards up the doors and Dwayne closes the windows before dark. Morgan then goes up to the attic with the rifle that Rick left him. He looks at old photo albums and photos of his wife. Then he raises his rifle and starts shooting at several walkers in the hope of luring out his revived wife. However, when she appears, Morgan breaks down and cannot bring himself to kill her. Rick returns to the park where he found a legless walker. After following the blood trail for quite a long distance, he finds her again, helplessly crawling. She reaches out to him uselessly. Rick apologizes to the walker for what happened to her, and then remorsefully puts her down with a shot to the head. Later, heading to Atlanta on Highway 85, Rick sends messages by radio from his car. In a camp outside the city, a group of survivors receives a transmission. Young blonde Amy runs to the walkie-talkie, but can't answer. Shane, Lori, and Carl are among the survivors, but they do not recognize Rick's voice from the distorted transmission. By the time Shane picks up the walkie-talkie and introduces himself, Rick has already left the emergency broadcast channel. Lori says she's been saying for a week that signs should be put up on the highway warning people to leave town, and voluntarily agrees to go herself, but Dale and Shane object that it's too risky. Lori leaves, and Shane follows her. Inside the tent, Shane tells Lori that she has to hold herself together for Carl, who has already lost so much. Lori agrees and they kiss passionately until Carl interrupts them without seeing their kiss. Lori promises him that she won't go anywhere, and tells her son to go finish his business. He runs away, smiling. Rick runs out of fuel on the road, so he dumps the car on the highway and sets off on foot with a can of gasoline and a duffel bag full of weapons, not forgetting to grab a family photo that he holds over the rearview mirror and hide it in his jacket pocket. He approaches the farmhouse in search of gasoline. He looks in the window, where he discovers that the couple committed suicide. Rick tries to find the keys to the pickup truck parked in the driveway, but instead finds a horse on the property. He gets into the saddle and makes the rest of the way to Atlanta with a bag of weapons slung over his shoulder. Arriving in Atlanta, he discovers that there is no safe zone, as described by Morgan and Dwayne. The whole city is abandoned, the streets are littered with corpses and abandoned military vehicles. Several walkers notice Rick and start chasing him. Suddenly Rick notices the reflection of a helicopter flying past a skyscraper. He speeds up his horse to try to follow him, but eventually comes across a large herd of walkers. He does not have time to escape and falls to the floor when the walkers begin to devour the horse. While the walkers are distracted, he manages to get under an abandoned tank. Several walkers notice him and start reaching for him from under the tank. Rick shoots several of them, but the walker quickly outnumbers him. Having no other choice, Rick decides to shoot himself in the head until he notices a hatch under the tank. He quickly climbs into it to escape from the walkers. Resting inside the tank, Rick takes the weapon from an apparently dead soldier, but the soldier suddenly wakes up. He is a walker. Rick quickly shoots the soldier in the head, but then becomes disoriented from a loud shot that rang out inside the tank. When he comes to, he notices his bag of weapons on the street. He opens the hatch at the top of the tank, but he is quickly noticed by several walkers. He closes the hatch when the walkers begin to swarm outside the tank. Completely surrounded by walkers, Rick, not knowing what to do next, decides to try to commit suicide again by putting a gun to his forehead, but before he can do it, he is interrupted by a voice that breaks through the radio in the tank. "Hey, you dumbass. You're in a tank. It's cozy there." A voice speaks. Rick looks up and slowly lowers the gun from his forehead.